The mountain man, with shoulders like granite and a beard the color of winter snow, counted out 50 silver dollars onto the auction platform, while the entire town of Cimarron, New Mexico, held its breath, waiting to see if he would really go through with buying the woman they whispered brought death wherever she walked. Zelda Jenkins stood on that platform in the scorching July heat of 1878, her dark hair tangled around her pale face, her green eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as though she had already left her body behind. She wore a dress so threadbare the sunlight showed through in patches, and her wrists bore the red marks of ropes that had bound her during the 3-day journey from the mining camp where her last employer had died. The auctioneer, a thin man named Wellis with a voice like crackling paper, looked uncertain as he glanced between the mountain man and the woman. "That is $50, sir," Wellis said carefully. "But I must warn you again about this woman. 3 families dead, 2 ranchers, a shopkeeper and his wife. Every person who has taken her in has met with tragedy within weeks. The territorial judge says she must be sold to pay her debts, but I would advise—" "I heard what you said the first time," the mountain man interrupted, his voice deep and rough as a rock slide. "Take the money." Nathan Owens had come down from his cabin in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for supplies, nothing more. He had not planned to attend an auction. He had not planned to get involved in town business. But he had been loading flour and coffee onto his pack mule when he heard the auctioneer describing Zelda Jenkins like she was spoiled livestock, and something in her eyes when he caught sight of her had stopped him cold. Not fear, which he might have expected. Not shame. Just a deep, hollow acceptance that made his chest ache in a way he had not felt since the war ended 13 years ago. The crowd muttered and shifted. A woman in a blue bonnet called out, "You will be dead within the month, Owens." Nathan gathered up his money from where the auctioneer had counted it, then turned to face the crowd. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with muscles built from years of hauling logs and hunting elk and surviving winters that would kill lesser men. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark brown waves streaked with gray, and his hands were scarred from 1,000 fights with the wilderness. When he looked at the crowd, most of them found reasons to look away. "I reckon that is my concern," he said quietly. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Very well, the debt is paid. She is your responsibility now, Mr. Owens. May God have mercy on your soul." Nathan stepped onto the platform. Up close, he could see that Zelda was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 23 or 24. Her face had the kind of worn look that came from grief, not age. She did not look at him as he approached, did not acknowledge his presence at all. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded once, a tiny movement. "Then come on. We have a long ride ahead." He climbed down from the platform and walked toward where his mule and horse waited at the hitching post. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps. Zelda followed at a distance of about 6 feet, like a shadow that did not quite touch its source. The crowd parted silently as they passed, mothers pulling their children close, men touching the brims of their hats, but not in greeting, more like warding off evil. Nathan loaded the last of his supplies onto the mule, then gestured to his horse, a sturdy roan gelding named Copper. "You can ride. I will walk." Zelda spoke for the first time, her voice hoarse from disuse. "I can walk too. It is 20 miles to my cabin, and the trail gets steep after the first 5. You will ride." She looked at him directly then, and Nathan felt the impact of those green eyes like a physical thing. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time, full of so much pain that he almost stepped back. "Why did you buy me?" she asked. It was a fair question. Nathan was not entirely sure he knew the answer himself. He settled on the truth as he understood it. "Because nobody should be sold like cattle. Because you looked like you needed someone to give a damn whether you lived or died. That enough?" Something flickered across her face, too quick for him to identify. Then the blankness returned. "People die around me." They were not lying about that. "People die everywhere. That is what people do. Not like this, not—" She stopped, shook her head. "You should have saved your money. Too late now." He gestured to the horse again. "Up you go." She moved slowly, like someone recovering from an illness, but she managed to pull herself into the saddle. Nathan gathered Copper's reins and began walking, the mule following behind them on a lead rope. The sun beat down mercilessly as they left Cimarron behind, heading northeast toward the mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the brilliant blue sky. They walked in silence for the first hour. Nathan was comfortable with quiet, having spent most of the last 6 years alone in the wilderness. But he found himself watching Zelda from the corner of his eye, noting how she sat the horse with easy familiarity despite her obvious exhaustion, how her gaze kept drifting to the mountains ahead as though she could already imagine herself disappearing into them. "What happened to them?" he asked finally. "The people you worked for." "You do not want to know." "I would not have asked if I did not want to know." She was silent for so long he thought she would not answer. Then she said, "The first family was in Kansas 3 years ago. I was hired to help with their newborn baby. 2 weeks later, the barn caught fire. The father went in to save the horses and the roof collapsed. The mother went in after him. They both died." Nathan waited. "The second family was in Colorado. I worked in their home for a month. The oldest son caught cholera. It spread through the whole family. Only the youngest daughter survived. She was 6. She screamed every time she saw me after that." Her voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion, which made it somehow worse. "After that, nobody would hire me for household work. I took whatever I could find. I worked for a rancher for 2 weeks before he was thrown from his horse and broke his neck. I worked for another rancher for 3 weeks. He shot himself in his study. His wife said I brought a darkness into their home. I worked in a shop. The owner had a heart attack behind the counter. His wife blamed me, said I had cursed them." "And the mining camp?" Nathan asked. "The foreman hired me to cook for the workers. I was there 5 weeks. There was a collapse. 8 men died, including the foreman." She paused. "His brother was the territorial judge. He said I could not be tried for murder because there was no proof, but I owed money for the supplies I had been given. The auction was supposed to pay that debt." Nathan absorbed this. "That is a lot of bad luck." "That is what I am. Bad luck, a curse, whatever you want to call it." She looked down at him from the saddle. "You seem like a decent man. You should take me back to town while you still can." "No. I will run away." "The mountains will kill you faster than any curse. You would not make it 3 days alone." "Maybe that would be better." Nathan stopped walking and turned to face her fully. Copper snorted and tossed his head, sensing the sudden tension. "You listen to me. I did not spend $50 just to watch you give up and die. You want to think you are cursed, you go ahead and think that, but you will do it from my cabin, where at least you will have food and shelter." "Why do you care?" The question came out raw, almost angry. "You do not know me, you do not owe me anything." "Because I know what it is like to have everyone look at you like you are already dead," Nathan said quietly. "I know what it is like to carry weight you did not ask for and did not earn. And I know that sometimes all it takes is one person who does not believe the stories." Zelda stared at him, her mouth slightly open. Then she closed it and looked away, blinking rapidly. Nathan thought he saw moisture in her eyes, but she brushed her face with her sleeve before he could be sure. They continued walking. The trail began to climb, winding through juniper and piñon pine, the air growing cooler and thinner as they gained elevation. Nathan pointed out landmarks as they went, not because he expected Zelda to care, but because the silence had begun to feel too heavy after their exchange. "That peak to the north is Baldy Mountain, highest point around here. The creek that runs past my cabin feeds from snowmelt off those slopes, so the water stays cold even in August. There are elk in the high meadows, deer in the forest, trout in the creek, black bear. Mostly they keep to themselves if you do not bother them. Mountain lions, same thing. Had a wolf pack move through last winter, but they did not stick around." Zelda listened without commenting. As the afternoon wore on, Nathan noticed her swaying slightly in the saddle. He called a halt near a small spring, helping her down from Copper and watching as she nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground. "When did you last eat?" he asked. "Yesterday. Maybe the day before." Nathan cursed under his breath and dug through his supplies, finding hard biscuits and dried venison. He handed them to her along with his canteen. "Eat slowly. Your stomach will rebel if you rush it." She ate like someone who had forgotten how food tasted, mechanically chewing and swallowing. Nathan filled his hat with water for the horse and mule, then refilled the canteen at the spring. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the rocks in shades of copper and gold. "We will make camp soon," he said. Another 3 hours tomorrow will get us home. Home. The word felt strange in his mouth. He had been living in the cabin for 6 years, but he still thought of it as a shelter, a place to survive rather than a place to belong. Home was something that had died with his family in Missouri, burned away in the violence that followed the war when raiders came through killing anyone they suspected of Union sympathies. Nathan had been away hunting when it happened. He came back to find his wife Sarah and his young son Thomas buried in shallow graves by neighbors who had been too frightened to do more than that. He had not wanted another human being in his life since then, had not wanted the responsibility, the vulnerability, the possibility of more loss. But something about Zelda's eyes had cracked through the walls he had built, and now here he was, leading a cursed woman into the mountains like some kind of fool. They made camp in a hollow protected from the wind, where Nathan had stayed many times before. He built a small fire and made coffee, boiling it in a battered pot and adding a pinch of salt to cut the bitterness. Zelda sat on a rock watching him work, her expression unreadable in the gathering darkness. "You can use my bedroll," Nathan said. "I will sleep by the fire." "I do not want to take your bedroll. And I do not want to argue about it. You will use the bedroll." She opened her mouth as if to protest, then seemed to reconsider. "Thank you." They drank the coffee in silence. Stars began to emerge overhead, thousands of them, impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. A coyote yipped somewhere in the distance, and another answered from a different direction. "Are you afraid of me?" Zelda asked suddenly. Nathan considered the question. "No. You should be. Probably. But I spent 3 years in the war watching good men die for no reason I could understand. Spent the last 13 years living alone, half hoping something would come along and finish the job. Fear kind of lost its hold on me somewhere along the way." Zelda wrapped her hands around her tin cup, staring into the dark liquid. "I used to be afraid of what I might cause. Now I'm just tired. Then sleep. Tomorrow is soon enough to worry about curses." She did sleep eventually, curled up in his bedroll near the fire. Nathan sat with his back against a boulder, his rifle across his knees, watching the flames burn down to coals. He had told Zelda he was not afraid, and that was true. But he was uncertain, which was almost worse. He had no idea what he was doing, no plan beyond getting her to the cabin and figuring things out from there. The night passed slowly. Nathan dozed in brief snatches, jerking awake at every sound, years of wilderness living having trained him to sleep like a prey animal. When dawn finally broke over the eastern peaks, he rekindled the fire and made more coffee, heating up beans in the same pot once the coffee was done. Zelda woke to the smell of food, sitting up with the wild look of someone unsure where they were. Then memory returned and her face settled back into its careful blankness. "Morning," Nathan said, handing her a plate of beans and biscuit. "Morning." They ate quickly and broke camp, continuing their journey as the sun climbed higher. The trail grew steeper and more rugged, winding through stands of aspen and spruce. Nathan watched Zelda closely, ready to call a halt if she showed signs of exhaustion, but she seemed stronger after a night's sleep and hot food. Around midday, they crested a ridge, and the cabin came into view below. It sat in a small valley carved by the creek Nathan had mentioned, surrounded by tall pines and backed by a sheer cliff face that protected it from the north winds. The cabin itself was solidly built from logs Nathan had cut and notched himself, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Near it stood a small barn for Copper and the mule and a smokehouse for preserving meat. "That is home," Nathan said simply. Zelda studied the cabin for a long moment. "It is beautiful." Something in her voice made Nathan look at her. She was not crying, but her eyes had that shine to them again, the one that suggested tears were close. He wondered when she had last seen something beautiful, when she had last had anything resembling hope. They descended into the valley. The cabin felt stuffy from being closed up for 3 days, so Nathan opened the shutters and door to let fresh air circulate while he tended to the animals. Zelda stood in the center of the single room, looking around at the simple furnishings. A rough-hewn table and chairs, a rope bed built into one corner, shelves holding supplies and cooking gear, pegs on the walls for hanging clothes and equipment. Everything was meticulously organized and clean, the home of a man who had nothing but time to maintain his small corner of the world. There is only one bed, she observed. I will build another. For tonight you take that one. I will use the barn. No, I can sleep in the barn. This is your home. Nathan set down the supply packs he had been carrying. We are going to have this argument about everything, are we not? I just do not want to push you out of your own bed. You are not pushing me anywhere. I am choosing. Now, there is a rain barrel outside for washing, and I will heat water if you want a bath. I have to hunt this afternoon because we are low on fresh meat, but I will be back before dark. Zelda wrapped her arms around herself. You are really not afraid I will cause something terrible to happen? If something terrible happens, we will deal with it when it does. But I am not going to live my life waiting for disaster. Tried that already. Did not much care for it. He left her there and went to check his traps and scout for game sign. The truth was, he needed some time away to settle his own thoughts. Having another person in his space after so long alone felt disorienting, like trying to remember a language he had not spoken in years. And Zelda herself unsettled him in ways he was not ready to examine. She was beautiful despite the exhaustion and grief that clung to her, and she was vulnerable in a way that made every protective instinct he thought he had buried rise howling to the surface. But more than that, she was real in a way nothing had felt real to Nathan in a very long time. Looking at her, talking to her, watching her struggle to accept simple kindness, it all reminded him that he was still alive, still capable of caring about something beyond his own survival. He found deer sign near a salt lick about a mile from the cabin and settled in to wait. Hunting required patience, stillness, the ability to become part of the landscape. Nathan had always been good at it. Today, though, his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, wondering what Zelda was doing, whether she would still be there when he returned, or whether she would try to run like she had threatened. The deer came at dusk, a young buck with a decent set of antlers. Nathan made the shot cleanly, tracking the animal only 30 yards before it collapsed. He field-dressed it quickly, hoisted the carcass onto his shoulders, and began the trek back to the cabin. Full darkness had fallen by the time he saw lamplight glowing in the cabin windows. Relief flooded through him, though he had not wanted to admit how worried he had been that she would be gone. He hung the deer in the smokehouse to cool overnight, washed his hands and knife at the rain barrel, and approached the cabin door. The smell that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Bread. Someone was baking bread. He pushed open the door to find Zelda at the fire, pulling a Dutch oven from the coals with a thick cloth. She looked up, and for the first time since he had seen her on that auction platform, something other than blankness showed on her face. Nervousness, maybe. Or hope. I found flour and starter in your supplies, she said quickly. I hope you do not mind. I thought I wanted to do something, to help. Nathan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The cabin smelled like a home, warm and alive. On the table sat the loaf of bread, golden and steaming, along with plates and cups already set out. I do not mind, he managed to say. Zelda cut the bread with his hunting knife, her hands steady despite her obvious anxiety about his reaction. Nathan poured water for both of them and sat down at his own table, feeling like a guest in his own home. The bread was perfect, crusty on the outside and soft within. Nathan ate 3 slices before he remembered to say something. This is good. Really good. I like baking. It is one of the things I'm actually useful for. Her voice carried a bitter edge. Before everything went wrong, I used to bake for church socials. People would come early just to make sure they got a piece. Why did you stop? Because people stopped wanting anything from me. Because I became the woman nobody wanted around their food, their families, their lives. Nathan chewed slowly, thinking. The bad things that happened. Did you cause them on purpose? Zelda looked startled. Of course not. Did you do anything that led to them? Did you leave a lantern burning that started the barn fire? Did you bring the cholera into the house? Did you make the horse throw that rancher? No, but then you did not cause those things. You were just there when they happened. That is what a curse is, Zelda said, her voice rising with frustration. I do not have to do anything. Death just follows me. It finds the people around me. Or maybe you have had terrible luck and people looking for someone to blame found an easy target. Nathan held up his hand when she started to protest. I'm not saying you are wrong about what you have seen. I'm saying there might be another explanation besides you being cursed. Zelda looked at him like he had just suggested the sky was green. You really believe that? I believe that bad things happen all the time, to everyone, and sometimes they cluster together in ways that feel like more than coincidence. I also believe that human beings would rather blame a person than accept that the world is random and cruel. She was quiet for a long time, pulling apart a piece of bread without eating it. What if you are wrong? What if something happens to you? Then something happens to me. But at least I will have had decent bread before I go. That startled a laugh out of her, short and sharp, like she had forgotten how. The sound transformed her face, made her look younger and lighter. Nathan felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. They finished the meal in more comfortable silence. Afterward, Zelda insisted on cleaning up while Nathan banked the fire for the night. He showed her where to find extra blankets, checked that the door was securely barred, and headed for the barn with his bedroll. "Nathan?" Zelda called from the doorway. He turned back. She was silhouetted against the lamplight, looking small and uncertain. "Thank you. For today. For all of this." "You are welcome." The barn was warm from the animal's body heat, and Nathan made himself a reasonable bed in an empty stall. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the night forest. Somewhere in his mind, he was aware that he had just upended his entire life for a woman he did not know, a woman who might indeed be cursed or might just be the unluckiest person he had ever met. But he was also aware that for the first time in 6 years, his cabin felt like more than just a place to wait out his days. It felt like something worth protecting. Someone worth protecting. He fell asleep with that thought and slept more soundly than he had in months. The next weeks fell into a rhythm that surprised Nathan with its ease. Zelda proved to be a tireless worker, attacking the endless tasks of mountain living with a determination that bordered on desperation. She mended his clothes, organized his supplies, weeded the small vegetable garden he had neglected, and cooked meals that made him remember what food could taste like when prepared with care. Nathan split his time between the heavy labor of preparing for winter cutting and stacking firewood, hunting and smoking meat, repairing the barn roof, and the finer work of building a second bed frame in the cabin. He constructed it against the opposite wall from his own bed, using pine he seasoned by the fire and fitted together with the careful attention of a man who had nothing but time. They talked while they worked, slowly at first, then with increasing ease. Zelda told him about her childhood in St. Louis, about parents who had died when she was 16, leaving her to make her own way in the world. She had been a schoolteacher briefly before the accusations of being cursed had followed her from town to town, making it impossible to keep any position. Nathan told her about the war, though he kept the worst details to himself. He told her about growing up in Missouri, about learning carpentry from his father and hunting from his grandfather. He did not tell her about Sarah and Thomas, not yet. That wound was still too raw, even after all these years. One morning, about 3 weeks after Zelda's arrival, Nathan was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard her scream. He dropped the axe and ran, his heart hammering, certain that the moment he had been half expecting had arrived. He burst through the cabin door to find Zelda standing on a chair, pointing at the far corner. "Snake!" she gasped. "There is a snake in here!" Nathan followed her pointing finger and spotted a small garter snake coiled beneath the wood bin. He almost laughed with relief, then caught himself when he saw how pale Zelda had gone. "It is just a garter snake," he said gently. "Harmless. Probably came in looking for mice. I do not care what kind it is. I hate snakes." Nathan crossed to the corner, carefully picked up the snake and carried it outside, releasing it near the woodpile. When he came back inside, Zelda was still on the chair, looking embarrassed. "I'm sorry. I know it was not dangerous. Everyone is afraid of something." Nathan offered his hand to help her down. "My mother was terrified of spiders, used to make my father check the entire house before she would go to bed." Zelda took his hand, and Nathan was suddenly very aware of how small her fingers felt in his, how warm her skin was. She stepped down from the chair, but did not immediately pull away, looking up at him with those green eyes that always seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. "You ran in here like you thought I was dying," she said softly. "I heard you scream. What was I supposed to think? That the curse had finally caught up with me?" Nathan shook his head. "That is not what I thought." Then what? That you needed help. That is all. They stood there for a moment longer, hands still clasped, something unspoken building in the air between them. Then Zelda pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself in that defensive gesture Nathan had come to recognize. "Still no curse," she said, trying for lightness but not quite achieving it. "You must be disappointed." "I am many things, Zelda. Disappointed is not one of them." He went back to chopping wood, but his mind was no longer on the task. He was thinking about the feel of her hand in his, about the way his heart had raced when he thought she was in danger, about how the cabin felt empty now whenever she was not in it. He was thinking, in other words, about all the things he had promised himself he would never think about again. That evening, after supper, Zelda asked him to teach her to shoot. Nathan looked up from the knife he was sharpening, surprised. "Why do you want to learn?" "Because if I am going to live in the wilderness, I should know how to protect myself, and because you cannot be here all the time." She hesitated, "And because I want to feel less helpless." Nathan could understand that. He fetched his spare revolver, a Colt Navy model he had carried during the war, and they went outside into the fading light. He set up targets against a fallen log, then showed her how to hold the gun, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger rather than jerking it. Zelda listened intently, her face set with concentration. When she fired the first shot, the recoil startled her and the bullet went wide. She tried again, adjusting her grip the way Nathan showed her. The second shot was closer. The third actually hit the log. "Good," Nathan said, standing behind her to adjust her elbow angle. "Keep your wrist locked. Let the gun become part of your arm." They practiced until the light failed and Nathan's supply of bullets ran low. Zelda's hands were shaking from the effort, but she had managed to hit the log 7 times out of her last 10 shots. "You learn fast," Nathan observed as they walked back to the cabin. "I am motivated. I do not ever want to feel as helpless as I did on that auction platform." Nathan understood that too. He had felt helpless once, coming home to find his family dead and buried. The feeling had nearly destroyed him. It was part of why he had retreated to the mountains, where the only life he was responsible for was his own. Except now there was Zelda, and he was responsible for her, whether he had planned to be or not. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it felt almost natural, like remembering how to use a muscle that had atrophied from disuse. August gave way to September, and the aspens began to turn gold on the mountainsides. Nathan took Zelda with him when he checked his traps, teaching her to read sign and move quietly through the forest. She was a quick study, picking up skills that some people never learned. More than once, Nathan found himself watching her instead of the trail, admiring the way sunlight caught in her dark hair or the small smile that appeared when she spotted wildlife. He knew he was falling for her, had probably been falling since that first moment on the platform when her eyes met his. But he also knew that Zelda was not ready for anything beyond safety and stability. She still carried the weight of all those deaths, still looked over her shoulder as though expecting disaster to strike. Nathan could be patient. He had learned patience the hard way, through loss and loneliness and long winters alone. One evening, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, paint the peaks red and purple, when Zelda said, "Tell me about your wife." Nathan's breath caught. He had not mentioned Sarah to anyone in years. "How did you know I had a wife?" "You talk in your sleep sometimes. I hear you through the wall. You say her name." Zelda glanced at him. "I'm sorry. I should not have pried." "No, it is—" Nathan stopped, gathered his thoughts. "Her name was Sarah. We were married for 4 years. She died during the war." "How?" Nathan told her, the words coming easier than he expected. He told her about the raiders, about coming home to find everything he loved destroyed. He told her about the years of wandering afterward, trying to outrun the grief, before finally settling in these mountains where the solitude felt like medicine. When he finished, Zelda was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Do you think I remind you of her? Is that why you bought me?" "No," Nathan said immediately. "You are nothing like Sarah. She was sunshine and laughter. She never met a stranger. You are quieter, more careful, wounded." "That does not sound very appealing." "It is honest, and I did not buy you because you reminded me of anyone. I bought you because it was the right thing to do." "And now? Why am I still here?" Nathan turned to look at her directly. "Why do you think?" Zelda met his gaze, and something passed between them, something electric and frightening and completely unexpected. "I think you might be the kindest man I have ever met, and I think I am terrified of what that means." "Because of the curse? Because of what happens when you realize I am not worth the trouble." Nathan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers trembled in his. "Zelda, you have been here almost 2 months. You have worked harder than anyone I have ever known. You have learned everything I have tried to teach you. You make this place feel like a home instead of just a shelter. If that is not worth my time, I do not know what is." "But I have not done anything terrible yet," she whispered. "I have not caused anyone to die. That does not mean it will not happen. Then we will face it if it does. Together." The word hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Zelda's eyes filled with tears, and this time she did not try to hide them. They spilled down her cheeks as she gripped Nathan's hand like a lifeline. "I am so tired of being afraid," she said brokenly. "So tired of waiting for everything to fall apart." Nathan pulled her close, and after a moment's hesitation, Zelda let herself lean against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, feeling how small she was despite her strength, how she shook with the force of emotions too long suppressed. "You do not have to be afraid here," he murmured into her hair. "Not of curses, not of the future, not of anything. I have got you." They sat like that until the stars came out, and Nathan felt something settle in his chest that he had not even realized was missing. Purpose, connection, the sense that his life might mean something again beyond simple survival. When they finally went inside, Zelda stopped at the door to her bed. "Thank you, Nathan, for everything. You do not need to thank me. Yes, I do. You saved my life, not just by buying me off that platform, but by treating me like I was worth saving." She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, quick and soft, then disappeared into her bed before Nathan could respond. He stood there for a long moment, his hand rising to touch the spot where her lips had been, feeling like the world had just shifted on its axis. October brought the first snows, light dustings that melted by midday but signaled the approach of winter. Nathan worked longer hours, racing against the weather to finish his preparations. Zelda worked beside him, no longer asking permission, but simply taking on tasks that needed doing. She proved surprisingly capable with an axe, splitting kindling with efficient strokes that made Nathan wonder where she had learned. "I worked in a mining camp, remember?" she said when he commented on it. "Everyone did everything. I split wood, hauled water, carried ore when they needed extra hands. You learn fast when the alternative is freezing." They had grown comfortable with each other, their conversations flowing easily, punctuated by companionable silences that felt natural rather than awkward. Nathan caught himself seeking out excuses to be near her, to work on the same tasks, to hear her voice. And he noticed Zelda doing the same, finding reasons to bring him coffee while he worked, to ask his opinion on small things, to smile at him across the cabin in the evenings. One night, a storm rolled through the mountains with unexpected fury, bringing heavy snow and winds that howled like wounded animals. Nathan woke to find the cabin shaking, shutters rattling despite being latched tight. He rose to check the fire and found Zelda already awake, wrapped in a blanket and watching the storm through a crack in the shutters. "I have never seen snow like this," she said. "It is beautiful and terrifying at once." Nathan joined her at the window. Outside, the world had vanished into a wall of white. "This is nothing. Wait until January. We get storms that last for days, snow so deep you cannot see the barn from the porch." "How do you stand it? The isolation?" "I got used to it, or I thought I did." He paused. "It is different now, having you here." "Different good or different bad?" "Different good, very good." Zelda turned to look at him, and in the dim firelight, her face was soft and open in a way he had never seen. "Nathan, A tremendous crash cut her off as something slammed into the side of the cabin. They both jumped, and Nathan grabbed his rifle from above the door, his heart pounding. Another crash, and another. Something was outside, something large. "Stay here," Nathan ordered, moving toward the door. "Are you insane? You cannot go out in this." "If the barn is damaged, the animals will freeze. I have to check." He barred the door behind himself and stepped into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his face with stinging force. He could barely see 3 feet ahead, but he fought his way toward the barn, following the path he knew by heart. What he found made his blood run cold. A tree had fallen, one of the big pines, and its branches had smashed into the barn wall, tearing a hole in the side. Inside, Copper and the mule were panicking, their eyes rolling white with fear. Nathan worked in a blur, calming the animals, leading them into the undamaged section of the barn, using boards and rope to create a temporary barrier against the wind. His hands were numb by the time he finished, his face raw from the cold. He stumbled back to the cabin and fell through the door in a shower of snow. Zelda was on him instantly, stripping off his frozen coat, wrapping him in blankets, pushing him toward the fire. "You fool! You could have died out there." The animals would have died for certain. You could have waited until morning. By morning, they would have been frozen solid. Zelda made a frustrated sound and disappeared into the darkness of her sleeping area. She returned with her blanket and wrapped it around both of them, sitting close to Nathan by the fire. "Then I suppose I need to make sure you do not die from cold now." Nathan could not help but laugh, though it came out more like a cough. "I thought you were supposed to be cursed. This seems more like saving my life." "Maybe my curse is broken," Zelda said, but there was no humor in her voice. "Or maybe it is just taking its time. Or maybe it never existed in the first place." They sat, huddled together, as the storm raged outside. Gradually, warmth returned to Nathan's limbs, along with the awareness of how close Zelda was, how her body pressed against his, how her breath stirred the air near his cheek. "I would not have survived this winter alone," she said quietly. "Before you bought me, I had given up. I was just waiting to die. And now here I am, wrapped in blankets with a stubborn mountain man who risks his life for his horse and mule. They are good animals. They deserve protecting. So do you." Zelda turned to face him, and they were suddenly nose to nose, sharing breath in the firelight. "Nathan, I need you to understand something. I am falling in love with you. I've been fighting it because I am terrified of what might happen, but I cannot fight it anymore. You have given me hope when I thought I had none left. You have made me feel human again." Nathan's heart was thundering so hard, he was certain she could hear it. "Zelda. Wait, let me finish. I'm falling in love with you, but I am also still afraid. What if something happens? What if the curse is real and I bring disaster down on you? I could not bear it if—" Nathan kissed her. He had not planned to, had not consciously decided to move, but suddenly his lips were on hers and she was kissing him back with a hunger that matched his own. The blankets fell away as they wrapped their arms around each other, holding tight as though afraid the other might disappear. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathan rested his forehead against Zelda's. "I love you too. I think I have loved you since I saw you on that platform, looking like you were already a ghost. I love your strength and your stubbornness, and the way you make bread that tastes like heaven. I love how you face your fear every day and keep going anyway. But the curse, there is no curse, there is just life, which is hard and random and sometimes cruel. But I would rather face that with you than spend another day alone pretending I am safe just because I am not caring about anything." Tears streamed down Zelda's face, but she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time since he had known her. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They kissed again, slower this time, savoring it. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin it was warm and safe and full of a hope that Nathan had thought he would never feel again. They stayed by the fire until dawn, talking and kissing and making plans for a future that suddenly seemed possible. When the storm finally broke and pale sunlight filtered through the cracks in the shutters, they went outside together to assess the damage. The fallen tree was massive, but it had missed the cabin by a good 20 feet, spending its force on the barn instead. Nathan looked at the damage and mentally calculated the work required to repair it. "This will take weeks to fix properly," he said. "Then we will fix it together." Zelda took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "That is what we do now. Together." Nathan pulled her close and kissed the top of her head. Together. The weeks that followed were full of hard work and harder weather, but Nathan had never been happier. He and Zelda repaired the barn, working side by side in the cold, their breath steaming as they hauled lumber and hammered nails. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Nathan would read aloud from the few books he owned while Zelda sewed or mended. One night in late October, as they were preparing for bed, Nathan said, "Marry me." Zelda looked up from the stockings she was darning. "What?" "Marry me. I know we have not known each other long, but I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want you to be my wife, not just the woman I bought off an auction platform." Zelda set down her sewing, her hands trembling. "Nathan, are you certain? Once we are married, you will be bound to me. If something happens, nothing is going to happen except us getting older and grayer together. Say yes, Zelda." "Yes." The word came out as a whisper, then stronger. "Yes, I will marry you." They rode down to Cimarron in November, before the heavy snows made the trail impassable. The town was shocked to see Nathan Owens alive, let alone accompanied by the woman they had sold him. The whispers followed them as they walked to the church, but Nathan ignored them, keeping Zelda's hand firmly in his. The minister, a man named Reverend Davies, who had always treated Nathan fairly, agreed to perform the ceremony. He did pull Nathan aside first, concern written on his weathered face. "Are you sure about this, son? The talk about that woman is just talk," Nathan said firmly. "She is a good woman who has had terrible luck, that is all." Even so, I am marrying her. Will you perform the ceremony, or do I need to find someone else?" Reverend Davies sighed but nodded. "I will do it, but I will pray for you both. We would appreciate that." The ceremony was simple, witnessed by the Reverend's wife and a young couple who happened to be in the church. Nathan spoke his vows in a clear, strong voice, looking directly into Zelda's eyes as he promised to love and protect her for as long as they both lived. Zelda's voice shook as she repeated her own vows, but she never looked away from him. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Nathan kissed Zelda with a tenderness that made the Reverend's wife dab at her eyes. They signed the registry, Nathan's bold script next to Zelda's more delicate hand, and walked out of the church as Nathan and Zelda Owens. The town was still whispering as they bought supplies and headed back up the mountain trail, but Nathan did not care. He had found something he thought was lost forever, a reason to hope, a reason to believe in tomorrow. And Zelda, riding beside him with a gold ring on her finger that Nathan had bought with the last of his savings, looked happier than he had ever seen her. "How does it feel to be a married woman?" he asked as they climbed into the high country. "Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure." She held up her hand, watching the ring catch the light. "I keep expecting to wake up and find this was all a dream." "Not a dream, real as the snow in the mountains and that mule who keeps trying to eat your hair." Zelda laughed and swatted at the mule, who had indeed been nosing at her hair. "I suppose if this were a dream, the mule would be better behaved." They reached the cabin as darkness fell, and Nathan built up the fire while Zelda unpacked their supplies. When the room was warm and the door was barred against the night, Nathan turned to find Zelda watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I am the luckiest woman alive, that I do not deserve you, but I am going to try to every day." She crossed to him, placing her hands on his chest. "Make love to me, Nathan. I am your wife now. I want to be your wife in every way." Nathan needed no further invitation. He lifted her in his arms, marveling again at how light she was despite her strength, and carried her to the bed he had built for himself, but which was now theirs. They made love slowly, tenderly, learning each other's bodies with the careful attention of people who knew how precious what they had found was. Afterward, they lay tangled together under the quilts, listening to the wind in the pines outside. Zelda traced patterns on Nathan's chest, her touch feather light. "No curse," she murmured. "No disaster. Just us." "Just us," Nathan agreed, pulling her closer. Winter settled over the mountains with the full force of its fury, bringing storms that lasted days and snow that piled higher than the cabin windows. Nathan and Zelda were trapped inside for long stretches, but neither minded. They had each other, and that was enough. They passed the time in 100 small ways. Nathan taught Zelda to carve, showing her how to read the grain of wood and coax shapes from it with patient knife work. Zelda taught Nathan to play chess using a set he had never learned to use, laughing at his frustrated grumbling when she beat him soundly. They cooked together, cleaned together, read aloud to each other from Nathan's small library. And they talked, long conversations that ranged from philosophy to practicality, from shared memories to dreams for the future. Nathan told Zelda about his childhood, about his parents and grandparents, about the carpentry trade he had learned and abandoned. Zelda told him about her years of wandering, about the loneliness of being always on the move, never belonging anywhere. "I used to dream about having a home," she said one night as they lay in bed listening to the wind. "Not just a room or a place to work, but a real home where I belonged. I stopped dreaming about it after a while. It hurt too much." "You have a home now," Nathan said, tightening his arms around her, "for as long as you want it. Forever then. I want it forever." Christmas came, and Nathan carved Zelda a beautiful wooden box with her initials worked into the lid. Zelda had secretly made him a new shirt from fabric she had been hoarding, the stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. They exchanged gifts by the fire, then made love slowly, the cabin warm and bright with lamplight against the dark winter night. As the new year of 1879 dawned, Zelda began to feel unwell. At first, Nathan thought it was just the effects of winter, the lack of fresh vegetables and sunlight that always left him feeling slightly diminished by February. But when Zelda began vomiting in the mornings, understanding dawned. "You are pregnant," he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Zelda looked up from where she was washing her face at the basin, her expression uncertain. "I think so. I am late and the sickness and—" She stopped. "Are you upset?" "Upset?" Nathan crossed to her, taking her face in his hands. "I am the opposite of upset. I am—" He could not find words adequate to the feeling swelling in his chest. Joy, yes, but also fear and hope, and a fierce protectiveness that dwarfed even what he felt for Zelda. "I am going to be a father." "We do not know for certain yet," Zelda cautioned, but she was smiling. "I know. I can see it in your eyes. We are having a baby." He kissed her then, pouring everything he felt into it. Zelda melted against him, and for a moment, the world was perfect. Then, doubt crept into her expression. "Nathan, what if something goes wrong? What if the curse—" "Stop!" Nathan held her at arm's length, looking directly into her eyes. "You need to let go of this idea that you are cursed. You have been here 6 months. Nothing terrible has happened. The tree that fell in the storm could have killed us both, but it did not. You saved my life that night by warming me up. If anything, you have been my good luck. But a baby is a blessing, not a curse. Our blessing." He placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a child, Zelda, a little person who is part you and part me. And we are going to love them and protect them and teach them everything we know. That is what is going to happen." Tears spilled down Zelda's cheeks, but she was smiling. "A baby. We are really having a baby. We really are." They spent the rest of the winter preparing for the child who would arrive with the autumn. Nathan carved a cradle from aspen wood, rubbing it smooth with sand until it gleamed like satin. Zelda sewed tiny clothes from scraps of fabric, her face soft with contentment as she worked. As the snow began to melt and green returned to the high valleys, Zelda's belly swelled with their growing child. She bloomed with pregnancy, her face filling out, her eyes bright with health and happiness. Nathan could not stop touching her, his hands drawn to the curve of her stomach where their baby grew. "I think it is a boy," Zelda said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "He kicks like a mule." "A son," Nathan tried out the word, liking how it felt. "We will teach him to hunt and trap and survive in the wilderness." "And to read and write and think for himself," Zelda added. "I do not want him to be just a mountain man. I want him to have choices." "He will have choices, all the choices in the world." Summer brought warm days and cool nights, and Nathan worked to expand the cabin, building a second room for the baby. Zelda continued working alongside him as much as he would allow, though he grew increasingly protective as her pregnancy advanced. "I am pregnant, not fragile," she protested when he tried to stop her from carrying water. "I know that. I also know that you are carrying the most precious thing in the world, and I am not taking any chances. You are going to be insufferable when I'm actually big. I'm going to be careful. There is a difference." But Nathan could not help worrying. The nearest doctor was in Cimarron, a hard day's ride away, and winter babies were risky even under the best circumstances. He tried not to show his fear, but Zelda knew him too well by now. "I'm going to be fine," she told him one night as they lay in bed, her back against his chest, his hand on her moving belly. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am strong and healthy, and I have you. That is all I need." "I cannot lose you," Nathan said roughly. "I would not survive it. You will not lose me, I promise." It was a promise Zelda could not really make, and they both knew it. But Nathan held on to it anyway, held on to her, and prayed to a God he had not spoken to in years that she would be right. September arrived with its golden aspens and crisp air. Zelda was huge now, moving slowly, her hands pressed to the small of her back. Nathan barely left her side, making her rest, bringing her water, watching her like a hawk for any sign that the baby was coming. The labor began on a clear morning in late September, Zelda gasping and doubling over as she was making breakfast. Nathan caught her before she fell, his heart in his throat. "It is time," she said through gritted teeth. "The baby is coming." Nathan had helped deliver calves and foals, but a human baby was entirely different. He tried to remember everything the old women at the fort had told him years ago when Sarah was pregnant, tried to stay calm even as panic clawed at his chest. He got Zelda into bed, boiled water, gathered clean linens. The labor went on for hours, Zelda panting and crying out, her face pale with pain and effort. Nathan held her hand, whispered encouragement, felt completely helpless in the face of what she was enduring. "I cannot do this," Zelda gasped at one point. "Nathan, I cannot—" "Yes, you can. You are the strongest woman I know. You can do this. What if something goes wrong? What if the curse—" "There is no curse. There is just you and me and our baby who wants to meet us. Now push, Zelda, push." She pushed and screamed and pushed again. And then, as the sun was setting outside the cabin window, a baby's cry filled the air, strong and angry and beautiful. Nathan caught his son in trembling hands, staring down at the tiny red-faced creature who was waving fists and howling with indignation. Perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair. Perfect. "A boy," he said, his voice breaking. "Zelda, we have a son." Zelda was crying and laughing at the same time, reaching for the baby with shaking arms. Nathan placed their son on her chest, watching as she cradled him close, her face transformed with love and wonder. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "Hello, my beautiful boy." Nathan cleaned them both up with gentle hands, marveling at how small his son was, how delicate. The baby had stopped crying and was rooting at Zelda's breast with instinctive hunger. She helped him latch on, wincing a little, then relaxing as the baby began to nurse. "We did it," she said, looking up at Nathan with exhausted joy. "We have a baby. You did it. You were amazing." Nathan sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out to stroke his son's downy head. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names during the long winter, but nothing had felt quite right. Now, looking at his son's face, Nathan knew. "Thomas," he said, "after my father and my son who died, if that's all right with you." Zelda's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas Owens. It is perfect." They sat together as darkness fell, a family now, complete in a way Nathan had not dared to hope for. His son nursed and slept, his tiny hand wrapped around Nathan's finger with surprising strength. Zelda dozed, exhausted but content, and Nathan kept watch over them both, his heart so full he thought it might burst. No curse, no disaster, just life, messy and painful and absolutely miraculous. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Thomas was a healthy baby, growing rapidly, hitting his milestones right on schedule. He had Zelda's green eyes and Nathan's dark hair, and a temperament that swung between placid contentment and furious demands for food. Nathan discovered he loved being a father. He loved the weight of his son in his arms, the milky smell of him, the way Thomas's face lit up when Nathan appeared. He built a sling so Zelda could carry Thomas while she worked, and the baby seemed content to watch the world from his perch against his mother's chest. Zelda blossomed in motherhood. The last shadows of doubt and fear seemed to lift from her, replaced by a quiet confidence that Nathan found beautiful. She sang to Thomas as she worked, old songs from her childhood, and the cabin was always full of laughter and the small sounds of a baby discovering his voice. They were isolated through that winter, but it did not feel lonely. They were complete, the three of them, a family unit that needed nothing beyond each other. Nathan taught Zelda more about wilderness survival, about tracking and trapping and reading weather signs. Zelda taught Thomas to smile and reach for objects, narrating the world to him in soft tones. Spring came, and with it the realization that they needed to make the trip to Cimarron to register Thomas's birth and buy supplies they could not make or grow themselves. Nathan was reluctant to take his family into town, knowing the kind of reception they would likely receive. But it had to be done. They rode down in late April, Thomas strapped to Zelda's chest in the sling Nathan had made. The town was as unwelcoming as Nathan had feared, people crossing the street to avoid them, conversations stopping when they passed. But Zelda held her head high, one hand on Thomas's back, and Nathan felt fierce pride in his wife's courage. They registered Thomas's birth at the territorial office, bought their supplies at the general store where the owner served them with obvious reluctance, and were preparing to leave when Reverend Davies approached them on the street. "Mr. and Mrs. Owens," he said formally, "I heard you had a child. Congratulations." "Thank you, Reverend," Zelda said quietly. Davies looked at Thomas, his expression softening. "May I?" Zelda hesitated, then gently pulled back the blanket to show Thomas's face. The baby was awake, looking around with wide green eyes. Davies smiled, the first genuine warmth Nathan had seen from anyone in town. "He is beautiful, a blessing." "He is," Nathan agreed. "The talk has died down, you know," Davies said, lowering his voice. "About the curse. People have noticed that nothing terrible happened to Mr. Owens. Some are saying maybe they were wrong about you, Mrs. Owens." "Some, but not all," Zelda said. "No, not all. But it is a start." Davies touched the brim of his hat. "You have a fine family. I hope you will bring the boy down to be baptized when he is older." "We will consider it," Nathan said. They left Cimarron behind and returned to the mountains, to the cabin that was undeniably home now. Thomas grew through the summer, starting to sit up, to grab at things with increasing coordination, to babble in sounds that almost resembled words. Nathan and Zelda watched his every development with the rapt attention of first-time parents, marveling at how a person could be created from nothing and become so completely essential to their happiness. In August, as they sat on the porch, watching Thomas crawl across the wooden boards with determined concentration, Zelda said, "I think we should have another baby." Nathan looked at her in surprise. "You want another one?" "I do. I want Thomas to have siblings. I want a big family, Nathan. I want this place to be full of children and life and love." Nathan thought about it, imagining more children, more voices filling the cabin and yard. The idea terrified and delighted him in equal measure. "Then we should have another baby." Zelda smiled, that full, radiant smile that still made Nathan's heart skip. "I love you, Nathan Owens. I love you too, Zelda Owens, more than I can ever say." Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah after Nathan's first wife, was born in the spring of 1881. She was tiny and perfect, with Zelda's dark hair and Nathan's strong features. Thomas, now 18 months old, was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly under watchful parental supervision. A third child, another son they named Daniel, followed in 1883, and a fourth, a daughter named Emma, in 1885. The cabin expanded again and again, growing into a proper house with multiple rooms and a second story. The valley around it bore the marks of a family's life: a large garden, an expanded barn, chickens scratching in a fenced yard, goats providing milk and cheese. Neighbors began to settle in the surrounding valleys, drawn by the same wilderness that had called to Nathan. Some were wary of the Owens family at first, remembering the old stories about Zelda. But those who met her found a woman who was kind and generous, quick to help in times of need, always ready with food or medicine or just a sympathetic ear. The curse, if it had ever existed, was forgotten in the face of reality. Nathan and Zelda grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lining with years and weather. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming something solid and unshakable, the foundation on which their entire life was built. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathan gave Zelda a necklace he had made himself, a pendant carved from elk antler in the shape of a heart. Zelda cried when she saw it, throwing her arms around his neck. "I never thought I would have this," she said. "A husband who loves me, children who are healthy and happy, a home where I belong. You gave me everything, Nathan. You gave me everything right back. You gave me a reason to live again." They kissed, while their children made exaggerated sounds of disgust in the background, then laughed and pulled their family close, all 6 of them in a tangled embrace. Years passed. Thomas grew into a strong young man who looked like his father, with the same broad shoulders and quiet strength. Sarah became a beautiful young woman with her mother's grace and her father's determination. Daniel was wild and adventurous, always exploring, always pushing boundaries. Emma was the scholar, always reading, always asking questions. Nathan and Zelda watched their children grow with pride and occasional terror, the normal fears of parents everywhere. They taught them everything they knew, how to survive in the wilderness, how to think for themselves, how to treat others with respect and kindness. And they loved them with a fierceness that never dimmed. In 1895, when Thomas was 16 and announced he was courting a girl from one of the neighboring valleys, Zelda cried for an hour. Nathan held her, understanding completely. Their children were growing up, moving toward their own lives. It was natural and necessary, but it still hurt. "We did a good job," Nathan said softly. "Look at them, Zelda. They are strong and smart and kind. We did that." "We did," Zelda agreed, wiping her eyes. "But I wish I could keep them little forever." "I know, but they need to fly. That is what we raised them for." Thomas married his sweetheart, Mary, in the summer of 1897, and Nathan and Zelda became grandparents when their first grandchild was born the following spring. Holding his grandson, Nathan felt the circle complete. He had lost his first son to violence and hatred, but he had been given a second son, and now that son had given him a grandson. Life continued. Love continued. Sarah married a schoolteacher from Cimarron in 1899, a good man who loved her dearly. Daniel headed west to California, sending letters full of adventures and promises to visit. Emma went to Santa Fe to study, determined to become a teacher herself. The cabin that had once held just Nathan grew quiet again as the children left. But it was a different quiet than before. Not lonely, but peaceful. Nathan and Zelda had each other, and they had a lifetime of memories, and they had the satisfaction of knowing their children were thriving in the world. They still worked the land, though Nathan's joints ached more than they used to, and Zelda moved slower than she once had. They still sat on the porch every evening, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple. And they still loved each other with the same intensity they had felt that first night in the storm, when Zelda had confessed her love and Nathan had kissed her for the first time. In the spring of 1903, 25 years after Nathan had bought Zelda off that auction platform, they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Thomas and Mary had brought all 4 of their children for a visit, and the valley echoed with laughter and shouts. "Do you remember what they used to call me?" Zelda asked, her hand in Nathan's. "A curse. And now look." She gestured to the scene before them, grandchildren running and playing, children who had grown strong and healthy, a family that had spread across New Mexico and beyond. This is what came from that curse, all of this. "You were never cursed," Nathan said, lifting her hand to kiss it. "You were blessed. We both were. I think you are right. I think maybe I was carrying a different kind of curse, the curse of believing I did not deserve happiness, and you broke it by refusing to believe it too." Nathan pulled her close, and she leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting against him perfectly after all these years. Their grandchildren played, the sun set in glory. And Nathan Owens, the mountain man who had bought a woman everyone called cursed, looked at his wife and saw only the greatest blessing of his life. "I would do it all again," he said. "Every moment, every choice, all of it." "So would I," Zelda agreed. "So would I." They sat together as darkness fell and the first stars appeared, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from pain and fear and desperate hope. The mountains stood eternal around them, witnesses to their love story. and in the cabin behind them, lamps glowed warm and welcoming, a home filled with life and love and the promise of tomorrows yet to come. The curse, if it had ever existed, was long forgotten. Only the love remained, as enduring as the mountains themselves, as constant as the changing seasons. Nathan and Zelda Owens had found each other in the Wild West, in a time when life was hard and death was close and survival was never guaranteed. They had found each other, and they had held on, and they had built something that would last long after they were gone. Their children would tell the story to their own children, and those children would tell it to theirs. The story of the mountain man who bought the woman everyone called cursed, and then called her his wife. The story of love that refused to bow to fear, of faith that created its own miracles, of two people who saved each other in all the ways that mattered. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with Nathan and Zelda sitting on their porch, hand in hand, watching the sunset and counting themselves the luckiest people alive. Because they had found love when neither of them believed it was possible. They had found home in each other, and they had proved, once and for all, that the only real curse is believing you do not deserve happiness. They lived out their days in the mountains they loved, surrounded by children and grandchildren, tending the land that had given them so much. When Nathan died peacefully in his sleep in 1910 at the age of 72, Zelda held his hand and whispered that she would see him soon. She followed him 3 months later, as though she could not bear to be parted from him for long. They were buried side by side in a small cemetery near the cabin, under aspens that turned gold every autumn. Their children and grandchildren kept the cabin as a family gathering place, returning every summer to remember the love that had started everything, the love that had proved stronger than any curse, any fear, any doubt. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the pines, people swore they could see two figures sitting on the old porch, hand in hand, watching the eternal sunset over the mountains of New Mexico. The mountain man and his wife, together for always, just as they had promised, just as it was always meant to be.